Or just hang on to them.
I usually hang on to it.
Yeah, they may be. Okay, okay, folks. Time to crank up. Appreciate on another dark and rainy day and foggy day that you came. A couple of people all the way from Goreville through the really foggy down in that Jimson's area. And I appreciate, I think all of you have been with me from the start, and here we are at the end. So it's always encouraging that most everybody's still around, and a couple of people had excused absences for the day. Tom Britton told me he was going to be in California visiting his relatives today, so I told him he could have an excused absence. That seemed like a reasonable out right there. This is the last day, and it is, as Larry just entitled, what is to be done, and that's what we're going to struggle with today, and I hope give you some reasonable solutions and some things to at least think about. As you can see, the title includes the critical role of civic education and an informed and rational electorate, and that's what I think I've tried to always be about, my ambition at least right there. I think I've laid out a long litany of things that have gone wrong or almost went wrong during this month that we've been meeting together. And in doing that, I don't want to come off as too pessimistic, although I've sort of leaned toward that, but I have tried to indicate that there are a number of good reasons for us to be seriously concerned about the state of our democracy and the state of democracy in the world, and whether or not democracy is winning the race against autocracy and dictatorship. And that's a problem in the United States. It's a problem in Europe. It's a problem in the less developed countries of the world. As I mentioned at the very start, President Biden started out campaigning on the assertion that there are very real problems in those developing countries, and that those problems are the question of which way do you want to go, toward democracy or toward autocracy. And I wrote all of that stuff that I talked about really starting with day one, even before the Russians invaded Ukraine. So that's a dark and somber enough outlook right there to hopefully focus our attention on this. And I appreciate that you have given your attention to this question for the last month. I do say on the plus side that I covered in the first and second lecture that there were some things that went very right in the test of our democracy in the 2020 election, and most notably in the aftermath. And at that climactic moment, which came on January 6th, January 7th, in the middle of the night, there was the decision set in place to have a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another under the legal and constitutional requirements that were in place. You probably note, of course, that dictatorships don't have that problem. They just make the president for life, no matter whether they like him or not. And it's almost always a him. Basically, dictatorships don't worry about peaceful transfer of power, except to worry about how to avoid it. And in order to avoid it, they sometimes do have elections, but those elections are really just window dressing. And I think the recent examples of the leaders of both China and Russia come to mind. Both of those guys are clearly president for life, barring something really extraordinary happening. And democracies face that prospect, and the lack of any accountability, the lack of any ability of the people being able to hold the leadership accountable. I did emphasize, though, that at critical moments at 2 a.m. on January the 7th, in the wake of that attack on the Capitol, the Congress did step up, and we can always be grateful for that, or I should say at least a majority of the Congress, certainly not all of them. And I gave credit I think in the first or second lecture, to the fact that Vice President Pence stepped up and did his constitutional duty. And it's worth a salute to the Vice President for doing that. And I noted the importance of Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Miley, did the same thing, and that kept the military out of the picture. And that was absolutely critical. But we can't always count on having some critical players with some backbone and some spine and some ability to do their duty and see their duty and follow the Constitution and the laws at the right time. There were plenty of people in very high positions in Washington that day and night that didn't do that and that did not have that kind of courage and did not follow what the Constitution requires. So today is about the long haul. How are we going to ensure that we don't get to those kind of critical turns? And if we get there, that the right people will be in place? Can we continuously strengthen democracy rather than undermining democracy continuously? And there's a lot of undermining democracy out there in our country. And I think it puts a critical role on young people to see that they're educated and socialized in a way that they understand these requirements and that they'll be a part of supporting democracy rather than endangering democracy. So what is to be done? I think you're interested in that, or you wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't still be here 5 weeks later since I started pounding on this stuff. Slide 1, Gary, if you would, please. There are some structural, legal, and constitutional changes, some of which we've touched on briefly, that have been advanced and are relevant. For example, we could change the Electoral College.
Yes.
Why not make the winner of the popular vote the winner of the presidency? That is majority rule, is definition of democracy. And electoral democracy is the form of democracy that we have in this country. I think a strong case can be made for that proposition, a theoretical case and one that appeals to political scientists and maybe some folks in this room. But I think I mentioned in passing, I don't think it will happen in our lifetimes. It takes 38 states, and that's not going to happen and not going to be politically feasible anytime soon. Number 2 is to do away with the filibuster. I talked about the filibuster one day. It is the most easily done of all. It could easily be changed. As I mentioned, it's just a rule of the Senate. It takes 51 votes to change it. But that's not likely to happen. It could happen if the Democrats had enough votes in the Senate, and that's more than 50 for sure. And the chances of them getting that anytime soon are fairly slim, as I've been indicating as we go along. Number 3 is one that I've been interested in, and that Paul Simon Institute actually has been interested in for a good long time. We've been working on this ever since Mike Lawrence was our director, and that is the question of drawing up the boundaries of both congressional districts and legislative districts in some more independent way with an independent commission, rather than the state legislatures, which is where most of the states are today, legislatures and our governors. That's one way I think we could create more competitive districts. And I've advocated that we simply recognize that there are going to be red districts and blue districts, no matter how you chop up any state, but particularly this state, you're going to get a fair number of safe districts. So I think you need to recognize that and then go on and make the objective how to get more competitive districts. And that's what we're failing to do. We critically need more competitive districts where there's real competition. And the theory is, and some evidence indicates the facts are, that you would get more moderate, more middle of the road candidates winning, and that they would have a wider audience and wider appeal. Most folks don't even know that was one of the major provisions of the Voting Rights Act that the Senate was considering and was Biden's bill. Well, the Voting Rights Act fell 2 votes short, thanks to the Democrats from West Virginia and from Arizona, and all of the Republicans who basically shot it down. So they didn't pass the Voting Rights Act. Not sure that they are going to pass one anytime soon, depending on what happens in the next, what's left of this Congress and in the next Congress. This is closely related to the question of having Voting Rights Act provisions guaranteed at the federal level, which is simply a return to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This, of course, would take legislation at the federal level again and would take the Democrats winning a majority in both the House and the Senate. In my view, this would take a seismic shift in the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court if the Congress doesn't act, and the chances of the Congress acting are not good anytime soon. Changing the Supreme Court is a ambitious and long-term prospect. Excuse me. Chase this frog away. And this is very closely related to the next point, which is reducing the impact of big money in politics. Same proposition, change the Senate, change the Supreme Court. In this case, for the Supreme Court to overturn the Citizens United, in the previous case to overturn Shelby County. Right now, there's a 6-3 majority on the conservative side, both of which are cases that the conservative side prevailed on. And I started to do a kind of a Socratic question here. I think I will do it, but I'm suspecting that at least one of us knows the answer to this. But my Socratic question is, when was the last time there was a Democrat who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and who was he? Anybody know?
Earl Warren?
Warren was the Republican governor of California.
That's right.
And the Republicans had a majority in the
Yeah.
Warren Court, although the Warren Court, which is the liberal to progressive court with a dominant majority, was composed of both Republicans and Democrats.
That's a
With
bad guess.
no, it's not actually. It's close.
Who was it? I didn't hear the
I
answer.
said Earl Warren, which is wrong.
Earl Warren is actually one off, Suzanne. Fred Vinson from Kentucky.
Oh, gee.
Fred Vinson was Chief Justice from 1946 to 1953. The Republicans have controlled the Supreme Court virtually ever since. The Warren Court left the scene in the 60s. I would assert, and Suzanne may take umbrage with this, or she can add to it if she wants to, but I would assert that this Supreme Court is out of step with the majority opinion of the country, probably more so than any Supreme Court has been since FDR and the first part of FDR and the so-called switch in time that saved 9. That is, they had a Republican majority that kept throwing out all the New Deal legislation and kept holding all that stuff. And they started the court packing plan conversation, and all of a sudden the court got religion and decided, well, maybe not all this stuff is unconstitutional. So the Republican majority at that time finally got the political word that it was time for a change. I bring up that analogy. It may not be a perfect analogy, but I do think the analogy that this court is way out of alignment with public opinion. You can say that's a good thing or a bad thing, and that's a relevant argument in itself. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about. But there's not going to be, in summary for this, a Supreme Court majority appointed by Democratic presidents anytime soon. So I think we might as well just get over that, other than somewhere way out in the future. Gary, slide number 2. Better civic education. I'm always for better civic education. Some of you are too. It's kind of the old saw. We need civics in high schools or whatever they're calling it now, and better teaching of American government and American history in universities. I taught intro to American government to tens of thousands of SIU students over a very long teaching career. And I'm discouraged about whether or not I did a whole lot of good with all of that.
Do they no longer teach civics in high school?
Oh, yeah, they teach civics, and I'm about to get to that, but I'm saying better teaching of and different teaching of. I don't want you to think, and this is relevant to that question, I don't want you to think that there's nothing being done. In fact, in Illinois, we've done a lot about the teaching of civics education. A lot of these problems have been worked on by very competent people. I'll list just a few of the basic ones from recent times. There is a set of new Illinois social studies standards that were adopted in 2014, and these increased the requirements for civic education. Gary, you part of that, or had you left? You'd left by then. Well, lots of school teachers put in a lot of time in public and private schools in Illinois when those standards changed. And I've looked at them. They're good standards, they're good ambitions, and the state of Illinois is working on it. We here at home, WSIU Public Television is a leader in this field. We have a service to school teachers throughout Southern and Central Illinois and lapping over into other states. It's called the Illinois PBS Learning Media Education and Community Engagement Office. A mouthful. Pat, this is Beth Spezia. You may know her. She is really good, and she works at this, and she puts PBS resources at the fingertips of school teachers making up their lesson plans. And we've got a rich variety of stuff up on the PBS section of what WSIU does, and school teachers and the public can take advantage of it. And lots of good things are happening there. The Illinois Bar Association, they have a long history and an active program trying to increase civic education, especially regarding the Constitution and the rule of law in general. For example, they do the Illinois State Bar Association High School Mock Trial Competition. They do Law School Day. They have a committee on law-related publications. And my friend Suzanne's here to add to that and talk about civic education briefly from the Bar Association standpoint and her own standpoint when I get done with this. All of these are good efforts, and they're encouraging efforts. And they recognize that there are two objectives to civic education. Number one is it makes the system work better. It makes democracy possible. It makes democracy more likely, but it also makes better citizens, makes better people if you have better citizens. And so it's a win on both sides. One of the things I do think that is under consideration and is slowly being done is the methodology in which we teach civics and American government and American history. There, I think we need to adopt to the modern world. We need more interactive learning. We need more effective use of the media, visual media. Many things out there now, like good simulations. We need those simulations. We need internships. I run a small internship program where we put people in local and state offices where they get young people an excellent access to what goes on in those offices. Anything to get our students more actively engaged, I think, is all to the good and terribly better than listening to somebody like me for way too long, because students don't do that very well anymore. Another thing that's closely related is we need better media literacy, as it's called, and there's some things being done on that front. I've got a nice bulletin or catalog over there on media literacy, what it is, how to do it, and that sort of thing, if anybody happens to be interested in it at the end. A lot of us, I'm speaking to the choir, have done a great deal in this field, and have spent a part of your lives. And when you're doing volunteer things, I think you're spending time on this very question. We've got people in here that have done League of Women Voters. The NAACP has been very active. The Carbondale Library has been very active on this front. I think even learning in retirement is an effort at better civic education. And so I commend you for having recognized that in one way or another. Having said all that, though, I wouldn't be on this rant if it weren't for the fact that the macro level, what we've done is still fairly far of the mark. It's woefully inadequate in many ways, because every poll, every study that's been done in public opinion, in political science, shows just really how little the American public knows, at least on the question of the basic facts. What are the basic facts about how the government operates? For example, a 2016 Annenberg poll found that on the most basic question of all, what are the three basic branches of American government? 1/3 could answer it. 1 out of 3. That's the first thing you learned, isn't it? I mean, in 5th, 6th, whatever, legislative, executive, judicial, most little kids even can sing that out, but they really don't know what that means. And if you go even deeper and get into factual stuff, increasingly people flunk. They just don't know, perhaps don't care. Returning to where John Foster and I were last week, the budget. We did Simon polls for 20 years on the same question. So we have change over time, very well documented public opinion about the Illinois budget. Without exception, the Illinois public recognizes that the budget has problems and has had problems for a long time in this state. But when we would ask the next question is, okay, we've been running a deficit for a long time, which by the way is not true now since the last 4 years, but we've been running this deficit. We got this huge deficit everybody's afraid of in the pension system. What should you do about it? And the first was cut waste and fraud. The second one was cut services. And the third one was raise taxes. What do you think came out #1 every year for 20 years? Cut waste and fraud. It's wildly popular. Everybody wants to cut waste and fraud. And that's incessantly what they get from the candidates out there on the trail. We can solve this. Cut the waste and fraud. Well, that gets real complicated real fast, and there's no line item in the Illinois budget that is labeled cut waste and fraud. Get rid of this. And one legislator's waste and fraud is another legislator's critical project or program for his or her district. I think the whole problem of understanding budgets and how those work is really a tremendous problem, and I really think it's tough to make much progress on that. Now, I've had, again, shifting back to the negative, but now I want to say there is a line of thought in my discipline of political science that, okay, American people don't know the facts, they don't understand that, but they do understand the overall. They understand the system, they understand here's the values that are important, and they share those values. My retort to that is you really have to understand some of the facts to have a basic understanding of how the system works. And I'm going to talk about some places where people don't really have the basics, so they can't understand the bigger. What people have by and large is headline value stuff. They know headline value of the day. And I think that's partially because of the changes in the media environment. There's the decline and fall of newspapers, particularly local newspapers in smaller markets, and numbers of newspapers massively changing downward over the last 20 years. And one that's not well recognized is the loss of local radio and local news on local radio. I don't know about you, but when I came here, I used to listen to WCIL all the time. It was in a storefront down there on barely on West Main.
Yes.
It was kind of a small operation, but that's where I went to hear Terry Caldwell, Larry Doyle read the news every morning and every afternoon. WCIL kind of still resists. It's out there on the highway, one of 6 radio stations stuffed into one building, and it's called River Radio, and they don't do Carbondale News or Carterville News because they are owned by a huge company out of San Antonio, Texas. There are 2 radio giants, both huge national operations, and that's what's by and large happened to local radio. And political leaders feed on that environment, and they feed that misinformation that's out there. Now, when I was in grad school about now more than 5 decades ago, political science, public opinion experts were quite aware then of the problems that were out there in terms of how much the public understands about the process, about the Constitution, about the Bill of Rights, and so forth. And certainly the major polls like Gallup and Roper and so forth had already been in place long enough that we knew 50 years ago that the answer to that was not very much, and that the understanding was fairly rudimentary. But the reply to that, at least in some quarters, was always back then, yes, but the elites understand it, the public opinion, the opinion leaders, as it's called, in the communities and in the larger nation understand those requirements, and they support those norms and values and mores that have to be there in place in order to have a functioning democracy. Their response was the leadership class will step up. They know the facts and they know the values, and they have those values. And when the chips were down, the political leadership class, the community leadership class will stand up and will be committed to democracy. Well, I've cited Herbert McCloskey and Alida Brill's book, The Dimensions of Tolerance. You're on slide 3. I'm going to read that because it's such a good quote, even though it's kind of tedious. These findings and observations serve to reinforce our earlier claim that tolerance of freedom and nonconformity is a response that not only has to be learned, but is often difficult to learn. It is especially difficult for people with little knowledge or interest in public affairs. Having little exposure to information and discussions about the meaning of civil liberties, they had less occasion to ponder such matters as the implications of freedom, the scope of the rights set forth in the Constitution, or the subtle and recondite arguments fashioned by the judges about the nature and limits of free speech, press, assembly, religion, privacy, or due process. Nor is the case for tolerance intuitively obvious. Well, that's what we're up against. That's the challenge, and it shows how complex it's going to be to solve and to deal with this challenge. Now, slide 4, there are some examples, and these examples are from the prior era, from the 1950s and on. Both the US Senate and President Eisenhower for a long time tolerated Joe McCarthy and what we now call McCarthyism, and his outrageous witch hunts is standing up on the floor of the Senate and talking about the thousands of communists that were in the US State Department, is destroying careers right and left and willy-nilly by charging them with being communist. This is one of the reasons Harry Truman broke with Dwight Eisenhower, because he thought Eisenhower was just putting up with and tolerating Joe McCarthy when he should have been doing something about it. They had a falling out at that point. They never got along. They didn't get along that great before, but they really never got along after that, because Truman just said, what's going on here? Why aren't you standing up to this guy? And interestingly enough, it was the only woman senator in the Senate that started the process of standing up to Joe McCarthy. Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine finally said, enough, it's enough. And here's what we're doing. And she said it on the Senate floor. And that started the process. A little bit later, the Senate actually censured McCarthy and stopped his sideshow in its tracks. Army McCarthy hearings, some of you will remember, and he declined very rapidly after that. On the good side for Eisenhower, he publicly rued the day that he had appointed Earl Warren to be Chief Justice. And he said Warren Court was way too far out front and way too far on the left side. And he once said, this was starting with Brown versus Board, by the way. He once said of appointing Earl Warren to be Chief Justice is the worst damn decision I ever made. And they did not have a great relationship at that point. I say all that to say Eisenhower had a lot of misgivings about the court, particularly Brown versus Board. But when the chips were down, and they were down for the first time in my home state of Arkansas, Little Rock Central High School, 1957, Orville Faubus led the charge to stop the integration of Central High School, called out the Arkansas National Guard to make sure that it didn't happen. The National Guard stopped the young black people, that 12 of them were trying to integrate the high school at the start of that fall September day. So 2 weeks later, and a lot of conflict and a lot of soul searching by Dwight Eisenhower, but he finally decided he had to get Orville Faubus and Arkansas under control. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, and he sent the 101st Airborne Division from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And 2 days later, they, again with fixed bayonets, didn't stop the black kids, but they marched the black kids into Central High School. And Eisenhower supported what the federal judge in Little Rock had said and what the Supreme Court of the United States had said under Brown versus Board. It's always up in the air whether you'd find a president with that kind of courage and do that sort of thing in this day and time, particularly in an era where there's an alternative reality and there are alternate facts and there's news that is so vividly displayed that a great number of people live in that alternative reality. Number 5, if you would. So I've established a case, I think, for the need for better civic understanding and some more improvement. I think the lack of understanding the basics and the fundamentals and elite level, leadership level, and media level understanding really does at times weaken our democracy and even imperil it. I've talked about methodology. Now I want to talk about substance. And I think number one, the first problem is our skewed interpretation and emphasis on individual rights, which I think we teach very well. Everybody got their idea now of what their rights are, and everybody's always way too eager to assert their rights. Well, maybe that's overstating, but certainly a lot of people are. We do that one very, very effectively. What we don't do is to teach the other side of the equation, which is with those rights go responsibilities. We don't get across the need to pay taxes if you're going to get the benefit of the public services, for example. Everyone wants to lower taxes, but not very many people are willing to pay for them. That's the finding that we've produced over and over again, 20 years of polling at the Simon Institute. Some of you will recognize what I'm about here is nothing more than the basic concept of the social contract, sometimes the social compact theory. That is, you need a community to secure the right of the people and achieve maximum freedom. You've got to have people understand that you get more freedom in a community than you get trying to live outside it. And I think the best example of that was the mass civics test that we just had. I mentioned this once before. I think we just flunked badly this whole question of whether or not we understood that when we started dealing with pandemic. Approximately 65% of Americans have been vaccinated. That's current situation. That means 1/3 have failed to do so or have refused to do so. Some of those were just careless, maybe ignorant, but most of them were people who adamantly and angrily refused to take the only real path available for community safety and for regard for community getting through this and having a solution was to get vaccinated and to wear a mask when necessary. I was on Tom Miller's talk show this morning early. It's a heck of a way to wake up, but it gets you in touch with Southern Illinois in a hurry. He's WJPF's guy. I think I mentioned him once before in here, and he does a great job, but he's a handful and he's got strong opinions. And we got off on this in my early morning radio broadcast, and he quoted the feeling in lots of quarters. He always represents Southern Illinois opinions in his view, and I think pretty accurately, and certainly Williamson and Franklin and up across that where they have their major market. He said thousands of people thought it was humiliating to have to wear a mask in public. And I said, then I did sort of, yeah, Tom, but here's what the government was trying to do. And he was in context of why people are mad at the government and why people are upset and not going to take it anymore. So we had a good exchange about that. But I was kind of taken aback by humiliating. It's inconvenient and uncomfortable at times, but I guess a lot of people somehow or another vested it with way more than it was worth. I said this in passing once before, getting vaccinated for me goes back to getting into the first grade in Waldo, Arkansas in the 1940s. And we were trying to get rid of smallpox. And then in the 50s, we got Salk vaccine and we got polio, and we largely got rid of those. And now don't kids or your grandkids, don't they get vaccinated against things like measles and mumps and chicken pox and all that junk? And we've mostly got all that stuff under control. Long and short, it should have never been politicized. And it indicates the extent to which people are just looking out for themselves and their values and their beliefs and their nonsense that they've got stuffed in their head about there being microchips in the vaccine. And I said to Tom this morning, the concept of herd immunity is one of the most fundamental collective community-oriented concepts I've ever seen. And it beautifully fulfills the requirement of the social contract theory. And we're just not getting enough of that across. Number two, another substantive area we fail egregiously is presidential power. I taught the presidency course for a number of years. Put succinctly, the American public vastly overestimates the power of the American president. We have a grandiose estimation of how powerful the president is and what he can do and what he can't do. This is a malady that the American electorate partakes in, and especially the media and many foreign people, leaders in other countries and international media. No matter what the problem is, the president's responsible and he ought to fix it now. In most areas of public policy related to the economy, for example, they think the president is the central player. Well, he's an important player in most public policy areas, including the economy, but he shares power with the Congress, the media, the interest groups, mass opinion, and the Federal Reserve. just as examples. Richard Neustadt wrote a classic book called Presidential Power, and he said presidential power is largely the power to persuade. And he says the American president can't give self-executing orders. It's not a military operation. And by the way, even in the military today, they understand that they don't give a whole lot of self-executing orders. He just can't give a command and it'll be done. He shares power, according to Neustadt, with what he called the Washington community. That's the Congress, the courts, the interest groups, the bureaucracy, all of those players that populate Washington as a city and the whole country, but centered in Washington. And he shares power with the people. What do we think of the president as president? What are the polls regarding Biden's job approval? The president and his party can't always or can always be constrained, but at election time, when you throw them out of office, if you don't like what they're doing, and that's that peaceful transfer of power. But he's got very limited power in lots of ways. He does have more power in the international and foreign policy field than he has in the domestic field. The area of maximum discretion in foreign policy and military power, however, is shared with international organizations, multinational companies and interest groups, and the media, and obviously other nations and other major leaders like Vladimir Putin, the president of China, Kim, the crazy one in North Korea, the Iranian Ayatollah, the prime minister of Great Britain and Israel, for example. He shares power with all of those. We have what I think is best summarized as the concept of the omnipotent president syndrome. We give unusual and really undeserved credit to the president for having power, and thus we lay blame to the president as well. I think in the economic area, for example, the education at the mass level is even worse than it is in sort of the fundamentals of politics. The discussions we're having about the price of gasoline, the role of the president in fixing that. We want the president just bring the price of gasoline down, do something. Okay, so Joe Biden goes and releases 100 million barrels, and that will have some tiny marginal impact and maybe a bigger symbolic impact. And it is direct action, and he can take action, so he's going to do it. And not surprisingly, he did. President's going to Iowa today. Anybody know what the heck he's doing in Iowa today? See the morning news? Yes, thank you. He's going to allow more use of ethanol in the summertime from 10% cap to 15% cap. It will do some minor things to the edges about the price of gasoline, but it pales in comparison to what the oil companies can do and what OPEC can do and what the international market is going to do, and a whole bunch of other players. This is also closely related to the issue of inflation, for example. And there the Federal Reserve is a major player, and most Americans don't really understand the basics of the Federal Reserve. They took the very tiny first steps just last month of trying to control inflation by increasing the interest rates for the first time in a very long time, got them up from 0, and they plan to repeat this 5 times this year. The Fed has 2 basic objectives, and they're written in the legislation. They're supposed to control inflation, and they're supposed to keep the economy growing. And the objective, according to the legislation, is the economy should be at full employment, create jobs. And unfortunately for the Fed and for us, those 2 usually work directly against one another. So when you do too much of one, you get the other, and when you do too much of that, you get the other. The Fed has control of what's called monetary policy, the supply of money and credit to the system, but they don't control fiscal policy, which of course the president and the Congress controls, and the president and Congress have to share that with one another. So unlike the Fed, there's already two players in what we do about fiscal policy, which is the tax rate and the rate of government spending. Most Americans don't know or don't care about all those fine points of economics. I can hear Steve Kraft out there somewhere in Zoom land. He's probably going to check in. As Steve knows and others know, the Fed under Jerome Powell acted, but many say acted too late. Maybe not aggressive enough, quick enough to get inflation under control, and we may all pay the price for that. Of course, they did not know that Russia was going to invade Ukraine when they made their earlier decisions, and that added fuel to the fire. There are all kinds of debates about Ben Bernanke and how he guided the Fed through 2008 and 2009, and then later than that. I think Bernanke gets high marks for that. And Paul Volcker back in the whip inflation now, Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter eras. Paul Volcker took really extreme measures then. So that debate goes on. Did they move fast enough? Did they move aggressively enough? And can they get inflation under control? And can they get inflation under control without killing the economy and having a recession? That debate's already starting right now. So I think the myth of the omnipotent president is out there, and I think it's harmful, and I think it's a bad part of our debate. And in this area, I think the progressive left is the major offender there, at least recently and oftentimes forever. But for example, the progressives in the Democratic Party blame the president for not getting the Voting Rights Act passed and not getting the Build Back Better Act passed. And they said that he should just fix it. Lean on those two senators, get them in line, and do a Lyndon Johnson on them. Well, people don't understand Lyndon Johnson's ways, number one, and what Lyndon Johnson had that Joe Biden doesn't have, which is he had a very serious majority, included a lot of Southerners, but he had way more Democratic votes, and he had something called earmarks. Lots of folks don't like earmarks, but Lyndon Johnson could say, I'm going to get that bridge built for you if you just give me that vote. And he could get that bridge built. And now earmarks are gone because reformers wanted the earmarks gone. The folks out there in the progressive left just said Joe Biden didn't want it bad enough, didn't work hard enough. He should have just gotten them people in line, and that should have been it. Well, it doesn't work that way, is long and short. I thought Trump summarized my omnipotent president thesis, and I think I coined that word. He got up one day and repeated it again and again at campaign rallies and said, only I can fix it. That feeds that whole theory better than anything I've ever seen. He got his chance and left a lot of things unfixed after January the 20th, and he's out there now trying to make a comeback. He endorsed Dr. Oz over the weekend, by the way, in case you didn't note that, and that goes back to our second or third conversation. Not sure how that's going to work out for him. Dr. Oz, in my estimation, is the old saying, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on television. It kind of summarizes his candidacy as far as I'm concerned. So sometime later, we'll have to return to how much role did Donald Trump play in this upcoming midterm election. What I think Trump should have said, and it would have been true, is only I can tear it up. Because positive public policy is hard and it's long-term and it's complicated. But you can tear the place down in a hurry, and you can tear down all kinds of norms, institutions, what we call in political science, the rules of the game, very quickly. You can take long-term policy positions that will have impact far over into the next decade just by being president. And you don't even have to share much of that with the Congress, the courts, and the bureaucracy. That's why we say in political science, in our system, it's much easier to defend the status quo than it is to change policy making and to change programs. Because to change the direction, change the basics about all of our major issues is very tough. It's very hard. It requires the building of a coalition, and it requires long and difficult work like the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and like Medicare and Medicaid and interstate highway system and all of that, that most of us think were for the good. And it's best illustrated by Trump's treatment of the international institutions that had been put in place really over 70 years at the end of World War II, starting with the United Nations, then NATO, then the European Union, WHO, WTO, the Iranian nuclear agreement, all kinds of other international trade agreements. All of those were torn down or seriously eroded, and it had taken 75 years. And I think it's taken a war with the Russians invading Ukraine for much of Europe and maybe much of the United States to be reminded of how important those international institutions have been to keeping the peace up until now. And I think probably unintentionally on Putin's part, he will have wound up in the long run strengthening both NATO, the European Union, and those other international organizations. And number three, Gary, it takes even longer to build up a culture, a political culture of civility, tolerance, respect for other people, respect for other nations. It's hard for Americans to understand and accept that they've got a point of view, they've got interest, and they may not be the same as ours. Civility and tolerance is sadly lacking in our political process today. People don't understand that the legislative process demands compromise, and it demands civility to get there. I think it's absolutely essential to understand that no one side, no one party, no one person can always be right. Others got things to contribute to the conversation. The legislators got to listen to one another, and nobody's got a monopoly on truth. But in a polarized world, it's hard to get that across because we've got a bunch of partisan fights underway. The Judge Jackson hearings and what happened to her in those hearings were all about getting ready for 2024 for a number of the players there. And they were making campaign speeches. And I will add, in the sense of balance, I think some of what the Democrats did to Brett Kavanaugh had some of those same qualities, and some of the people running for president there didn't distinguish themselves. And I thought Dianne Feinstein mishandled her role in all of that. So it's not all just one side that does this. Getting ready for the next campaign. Madison and Hamilton knew what they were doing when they created checks and balances and separation of powers, but they assumed that people at that level, at their level, elite level, would understand that that was the only way separation of powers would work. But what we've got is a polarized society and a polarized Congress, and we get gridlock out of it most of the time. So Biden's concept in the speeches he made consistently in the campaign was on to something. I'm not sure people paid much attention to it at the time, but he kept saying, are these authoritarians going to be the wave of the 21st century? Are these authoritarian governments going to spread as they're doing in some places in East Europe, for example, and certainly in Africa and certainly in some parts of South America? Are more people across the world going to be convinced that authoritarian rule is more efficient, that they get to what they want, for example, on economic development very quickly and much more quickly than you can get there by democracy? And after all, our Constitution is a throwback to the 1700s. It's the longest single constitution, written constitution in the history of the world, and it's still there, more or less. And it depends on us understanding these things about the social contract. Think about Ted Kaczynski, for example, the guy who was the Unabomber, goes and lives in the woods, and look how well that worked out for him and the rest of society, that you had some nut went out there and lived in the woods and kept sending bombs. Social compact theory, Hobbes said, life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Nancy will tell you, I had a colleague in graduate school in political science. He was a short guy, and we called him Hobbes because we said, and particularly the wives said that he was nasty, brutish, and short. And he actually liked it. He laughed at it. So I'll tell you what kind of tough little guy he was. But no nation can go it alone, and no individual really can go it alone. We look at North Korea, for example. We need to start teaching those lessons. And in conclusion, Gary, slide 6, I'm going to get back to our friend Barbara Walter here nearing the end, where we talked first day about her book, How Civil Wars Start. 3 very relevant quotes near the end of her book. She says, number 1, the best way to neutralize a budding insurgency is to reform a degraded government. Bolster, make the government useful and getting something done, in other words. Bolster the rule of law. Give all citizens equal access to the vote and improve the quality of government services. Page 213, governments can undercut support for the extremists by reducing grievances, providing benefits for all citizens, and supplying hard evidence that playing within the system is more fruitful than defecting. Again, my conversation with Tom Miller this morning, he talked endlessly about grievances and how many grievances we have in Southern Illinois and how much we have got of resentment toward the state and toward Chicago and toward Springfield. That's what we're talking about. Page 214 and 15, quote, nothing abets an accelerated factionalism as much as the social media. We must curb the dissemination of hate and disinformation. Conspiracy theories are a big driver of our problems. The federal government should regulate the social media. Well, that one would certainly be controversial, but the social media are also certainly a part of the big drivers that make all of this very difficult. So all of that is good advice in my estimation, at least worth the debate. So concluding where I started, are we on the cusp of a civil war? Well, no, not in the literal classic sense of what we think of as civil war, as I have mentioned and talked about in the first lesson. And I haven't changed my mind over 5 weeks. And my wife would tell you I may occasionally change my mind, but it wouldn't be over 5 weeks. 5 years might be closer, or 50 years sometimes, but not always. So I didn't change, although I hope I elaborated a little on why I think that. But at the same time, I do think democracy is in trouble in this country and that we can and must do better as a government and as a system and as citizens. We've got too many loud and confrontational voices in our government getting elected in order to be stars on one cable news channel or the other, because they are not there for the legislating. They are show horses and not work horses, and they're looking for the sound bites that they can create that day. So, Lindsey Graham, I'm talking to you here. At the mass level, we've got way too much voting our emotions and our gut and being proud of it, rather than leading with our head and trying to learn enough to be rational and to be fact-driven when we make our choices. We've got too many people running around advocating and threatening the use of violence. We've come to think violence is a part of how it all should be done, and too many people don't have any problem with that. We've got way too many people, particularly young people, who think you resort to guns and shooting one another when you get a score to settle with whoever your opponent is at the moment. And you got to avenge some perceived insult that you used to have to settle other ways and go out and have a fist fight or whatever. And now they get out their gun and start shooting, and streets of Carbondale are a real example of what I'm talking about here. Young people are not getting the idea that there are other ways to do the settlement of disputes, and that violence and whipping out your gun and start firing randomly and wildly, it seems to me at least, is not the answer. And we've got too many organized and semi-organized groups that think putting more guns out there and encouraging more violence to settle scores is the way to go. And all of that, I think, was on full display in January 6 and 7 of 2021. And we're still trying to process what happened in that catastrophe. And as I said before, we really narrowly avoided a constitutional crisis coming out of that. We should hope that America as a nation learned its lesson from that day, and maybe some part of the population did. But what happened that day is still very much up for grabs and for interpretation. And it's a massive civic lesson, but a lot of people have taken quite different lessons from what happened that day. And that narrative is still unfolding. But the stakes are high. If we don't get our act together and get a government that is competent and civil and starts addressing the real problems and try to get around the gridlock of extreme polarization, then the other nations will look at us and say, maybe authoritarianism is the best way to go. And maybe the one-party states with one dictator at the top and he'll be president for life is what they will want. And they will want to not emulate us, but emulate the Chinese, the Russian, or whatever. I think we can meet these challenges, but I think on producing civic engagement, thoughtful citizens, smart and wise leaders, that we won't succeed unless we realize some of the fundamentals of what the system should be about. And what it should be about, in my estimation, can very well be summarized in the preamble to the Constitution, which says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Seems to be a good point to close. Suzanne.
Yeah. John, I'm going to add one name to your list of heroes for January 6th.
Okay, go for it.
Dan Quayle.
Yeah.
Yes. Who would believe that Dan Quayle, not particularly an impressive US senator who became vice president, would be the one that parents would call and seek advice from, and the one who would say, Mike, it's over, stop, don't do it.
Right, amazing.
I predict that the first line of Dan Quayle's obituary will be Dan Quayle, comma, who advised Mike Pence about the role of the vice president, comma, died today. So not that I'm suggesting he's going to die today. Let me pick up a little bit on the civic education issue that John talked about. First of all, the question of, do we teach civics anymore in Illinois? Let's just limit Illinois. I think it was 4 years ago, Illinois passed a law requiring that we teach civics. Why? Because we hadn't been. Now, there has been for years a law that said we had to teach American history and American government. That was done. Question is, how well was it done? But it was done. Now we have to have an additional 6th semester of civics education. That leaves us with the question of, what do we do in that course? I, like John, come from that era where I love those triangles where it says, you know, Supreme Court, and it's balanced with this, and then the president's balanced with this. That ain't going to work today. Let me tell you 2 examples of a good program. So if you have Drive 13 to Belleville, from Pinckneyville to Belleville, you drive through Coderville. It's right on the edge of Randolph, Perry, and St. Clair counties. There's a couple thousand people in Coderville. Here's what they did in Coderville a few years ago. So the teacher says to the kids, and this was grade school, identify a community concern and how you could make it better. The kids came up with the fact that at the close of school, there's congestion because the cars are all parked and the kids are running to get mom and dad, and traffic, and somebody's going to get hurt. So okay, so what are we going to do about it? So the kids came up with the plan. We should make that a one-way street. And then all the cars are going the same way, the kids, cars, parents. Okay, how are we going to get that done? So they had to learn a little bit about city government. Do we go to the police? Do we go to the mayor? Do we go to the city council? Well, they figured it out, and they went, wrote a letter, gave a speech. It is now a one-way street. And I can tell you, I drove through Coderville yesterday. It is still a one-way street by the school. What did those kids learn? Well, they learned that that old adage, you can't fight City Hall, is not true. They learned that you could. You can make a difference. You can take ownership of a community problem. You can come up with a solution, and you can actually get it done. They learned that they had to understand how city government works. They learned that they needed to read and write and speak in a persuasive way with facts to support their positions. I hope that those kids, and this is at least 10 years old, have grown into citizens who take that into their livelihood. There's one example. So yeah, I want them to learn about all that stuff that we all learned about and maybe remember, but I want them more so to understand that they can make a difference. They own the government. They need to participate. They need to take risks. They need to take action in a nonviolent fashion. Second example, the MacArthur Foundation, you know, it's housed in Chicago, has created something that they call democracy schools. And they give awards to schools, grade schools and high schools throughout the state that fit what they call a democracy school. Carbondale High School got that award a few years ago. It did so because it has a ton of organizations for kids to belong to that take up that idea of take ownership and make a difference. So some of them are things that you and I might consider not too major, but one of them, for example, was putting together money to send to an organization in Africa that digs wells so that people can have water and mothers and kids don't have to walk miles every day to get water. So the idea at Carbondale High School was they were learning there are problems out there, community needs, we can do something about them. That's the kind of civics education that needs to be part of a whole program. Now, there needs to be the good old basics that we all learned, but it also needs to get to kids at an involvement level, at a personal level. One more example, I saw this lesson plan 40 years ago. Give kids a Hershey almond bar and have them figure out where'd the chocolate come from? Where'd the almonds come from? Where'd the paper come from that it's wrapped in? How did it get here? Well, the chocolate came from somewhere probably in Latin America. The paper probably came from Canada. The almonds probably came from California, but they shouldn't be growing almonds because they don't have enough water to begin with, but that's another issue. So we're all united was part of that lesson plan there. Sandra Day O'Connor is another one of the heroes of the civics education movement. I don't know if you know this, but sort of building on what you said, John, she once said, more people know the judges on whatever the show was, the singing, whatever it is, than know the justices of the US Supreme Court. She devoted a lot of her time after retirement to civics education. As you probably know, she's suffering with Alzheimer's and she's retired from public life. But she put a lot of effort into publicizing civics education, and under her auspices was designed something called iCivics. I meaning it's on the internet. It's games. I've been on it, I don't get it, which tells me that any 10-year-old will get it. But it's things like, do I have a right? So, you know, somebody comes in and talks to a lawyer, here's a situation, do I have a right? It's things like, how do you balance the federal budget? So it's all kinds of role play simulations that kids can do on. All of that is teaching, again, the basics. It's your government, it's your nation, you can own it, you can do something about it. Now, having said all that, we're not unrealistic. We know about the filibuster, we know about political gerrymandering, we know about jurisdictions or districts in Illinois, in the US that are basically uncontested because they're guaranteed to be one party or the other. But if we don't instill some hope in kids at some basic level, we're not going to get any farther. The American Bar Association had, back in the 50s, you may know this, Eisenhower created Law Day.
Yeah.
Back in the 50s. Do you know when Law Day is?
May sometimes.
May 1.
Oh.
Why? Because May 1 was the day when the Soviets had the big parades.
Yes.
Remember the photos? You'd see the leadership of the Soviet, whatever it was called, on the top of the buildings, watching the parades as the tanks and the soldiers and the planes went by. And we would all figure out now who's standing next to whom. So what's the leadership succession in the Soviet Union? So Eisenhower created Law Day at the recommendation of the American Bar Association to recognize that while power there rests in their military, all those troops marching past, power here resides in the American legal system. So we have Law Day. It's great. Lawyers go out. We have call on your lawyer for free day. We have lawyer. By the way, there's starting to be lawyers in the library. The Carbondale Library has a lawyer once a month for 2 or 3 hours where you can go in and talk.
Yeah.
Anna Library, I just saw in the paper the other day, is starting that. Of course, having used the word I just saw in the paper the other day tells you my age, because the average person under 60 is not reading a paper. So if it didn't show up on whatever their news feed is, they won't know it. But a lawyer is available, go in and talk. Those are great. I'm all for those. The Illinois State Bar Association did the mock trial program. I used to be part of that. I'm all for it. But if we aren't teaching every kid, not just the ones that go to mock trial, not just the ones that join some organization, but every kid, the basics, then we fail. And how are we going to do that? Well, we've got to improve college and university education of people who are going to be teachers. So the new Illinois law that requires civics, yes, thank you. Good idea, but let's make sure we do it well. Another group that does it well is the Future Farmers of America, the FFA. They really teach leadership and participation and so on. Yeah, you know about the FFA. So that's most of what I wanted to say. Let me pick up on one other couple things that you were saying, John, with regard to the Senate hearing. So we all know that we just recently had the Senate hearing for Judge Jackson, Justice. Now, well, she's not yet Justice Jackson, soon to be Justice Jackson. We use the term judge until you get to the US Supreme Court, then we call him justice. In Illinois, the appellate court and the Illinois Supreme Court judges are called justice. I don't know why. I'm willing to bet that somebody wanted a little more prestige, but I don't know that that's true. So Jackson is going to be the first person since Thurgood Marshall that has sat next to a criminal defendant and waited a verdict. So of the other 8 currently on the court, or those who've been on the court since Marshall's day, none of them practiced criminal law. Now, there is a lot to be, well, most of them haven't practiced law in a more traditional sense. Now, Alito has, Sotomayor has, most of them come out of law firms where they're representing more elite groups, and they're representing them at the appellate or Supreme Court level. I mean, John Roberts had argued, I don't know how many cases before the US Supreme Court before he was appointed to the court. Elena Kagan was dean of a law school. She probably can't find her way to the local courthouse to handle an ordinance violation. Brilliant woman, nothing against her, okay? But at some point, somebody has to understand what it's like on a day-to-day basis. Who do they hire as their law clerks? Most of the law clerks at the US Supreme Court for years now have come from one of 11 law schools.
Yes.
Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, University of Virginia, I forget the others. It was a big deal that Barrett came from Notre Dame and not from the elite. So Jackson's the first since Marshall to have sat next to somebody and awaited a verdict. I've sat next to somebody and awaited a verdict, but not for a criminal case. The only thing that issue was money. But if it's your life or your freedom, makes a difference. So I think that's important. Now, how'd the media handle it? Well, they were so busy with Graham and Cotton and Holly and Cruz, as well as the war. I understand that. There wasn't a lot of bandwidth time, but did they talk about the role of a public defender? Did they talk about the fact that when your kid or your grandkid or your great nephew gets in trouble, you'd like somebody, even if they can't afford it, the public defender who understands the system and can make sure the evidence is there. And if it's not, get them off, as we say. And if it is, work the best deal. Yes.
And they actually went after her.
Yes. 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 Because she was a public defender for one of the terrorists or alleged terrorists in Guantanamo. That wasn't an assignment. What people don't know right now, this moment, the local courthouse or the local federal courthouse could appoint me to a criminal case. When I become a lawyer, the court can appoint me to a case anytime, any place, anywhere. For years, that's how capital defendants, capital alleged murderers, people capable of being sentenced to death, they would take the most recent graduate. Hey, you represent this guy. When we still had the death penalty, Illinois said enough of that. And we created a capital bar, capital meaning death penalty bar. So if you were going to represent somebody in a death penalty case, you had to be a member of the capital bar, which meant additional training, and they had access to money to hire experts. So Jackson is demeaned for doing what every one of us who's a lawyer has a responsibility of doing, which is representing someone when appointed to do something. So getting into your point about media literacy, did the media use that opportunity to talk about the role of a county public defender? Go back to the OJ trial. Did they use that opportunity to talk about women who are abused and what might we do about it? we were too busy with the headline stuff, as John said. So, say, question.
I was just thinking that the media does that about everything.
Yeah.
There's no in-depth ever.
Well, not only is there no in depth, but there's not even headlines about stuff that we might consider important if it doesn't rise to that level. It irritates me. Josh Hawley is a graduate of Yale. Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton are graduates of Harvard. Ben Sasse, whose questions were a little better, is a graduate of Yale. If I were the deans of those two law schools, I'd be saying, what did I spend my money on to train these guys? But I am waiting the day, John, you can really tell me here I'm unrealistic. I am awaiting the day when Senator O'Connell, Susan, why am I blanking on her name? Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski stand up together in the US Senate and give a speech on the theme of how dare you, have you no shame? I probably will die before that happens, but I'm living for that day. One last thought, John, and I'll return the lectern to you. Sorry?
Do you have a choice? You said you're appointed to defend somebody. Do you have a choice to say no?
No,
You have to do it.
unless I have a conflict.
Okay.
Now, the reality is, in today's world, in Illinois, we have what we call, I don't even know what the name of it is now, I think. They have lists of attorneys who volunteer to be appointed, okay? Often they are young attorneys who want some experience, but they're not going to be appointed to a capital case. The federal court in Benton, U.S. District Court in Benton, as well as East St. Louis, regularly appoints attorneys in the area to represent prisoners if they have a case that passes what I call the blushability test. Because prisoners file lawsuits every day. Okay, some of them are, they don't have potatoes in the line that I eat at the dining room.
Yeah.
Well, too bad. But some of them are serious, and the courts appoint people all the time. A lot of that comes from people that are volunteer. A lot of it comes from people at the university that they know they can talk into.
Do you get paid for that?
Yeah, well, in Illinois, yes.
Where does it come from?
Depends upon if the state, if I was appointed in Jackson County, it would come from county funds. If I was appointed by the U.S. the U.S. Court in Benton, they would have a fund for that. So taxpayers.
That was the question.
Now, here's the thing about Illinois public defenders, and John, I will surrender the lectern in just a moment. In Missouri, the public defender system is statewide. Missouri is not known as being the most progressive state around. They have a statewide public defender system. So the rates are set and everybody gets paid that rate throughout the state. Does not depend upon what county you're going to. And if you want to be a public defender in Missouri, you're probably going to get sent to one of the rural counties. But the promise is go there for 2 years and we'll move you to your choice. In Illinois, the public defender system is county by county. Who pays for it? The county taxpayers. Do you want your taxes to go up so we can hire more public defenders in Jackson County to get off those guys that we know are guilty anyway? I mean, that's the thinking of a lot of voters and a lot of county board members who know their one job in life is don't raise taxes. So we don't pay, we don't have a statewide system. The amount that I'm paid as a county public defender in Saline County might not be what I get in Polk County and might not be what I get in Sangamon County. And the staffing and the resources to support me might not be the same. I have to say Missouri does it better on that issue. One last thing on this, I will stop. I was here 3 weeks ago and I talked about the redistricting of the county districts in the state, court districts in the state of Illinois. Well, John suggested that I write a paper on it. And because I don't like to ignore John's recommendations, I have done that. And it's almost done, John. And one of my conclusions there is no system is as good as good people doing good things. Good people with good intentions who are well-informed and skilled doing good things. And, you know, I'm 100% with John. We can reform the Electoral College. We can reform the presidency and make it something else. We can do any of these things. We can get rid of the filibuster. Nothing is going to be as good as every one of us getting ourselves as well informed as possible and doing the right thing. And in that regard, to build on something John said earlier, WSIU during April and May are running a whole series of interviews with candidates for state government.
Yes.
Many of our local state reps and state legislator, state Senate candidates were unopposed. So you may say, well, why do I bother? Well, because they are there and you ought to know what they stand for, even if they're unopposed. So I would urge you to check it out. And
isn't the local ones on Thursday nights? I believe.
you may know more than I.
I'm sure some people know more than that.
At any rate, my one gripe about, is anybody in here? Are you on the WSIU board, Friends board? Is anybody on the Friends board? I know this complaint's going nowhere, but I miss the old paper preview magazine that I could look up and, oh yeah, I think I want to tune into that. Now I got to think to go online and find the schedule, but we live in this world. We're going to have to deal with this world. So please go online, find the schedule for these things and check it out so that you can be that good informed citizen. With that, John.
Okay,
end of my
thank you,
preaching.
Suzanne. Two quick things to add. Suzanne did write an earlier paper for us in the Simon Review series, and it was on civic education. She has thought hard about this and gave us a paper that became one of our best sellers, actually. It had hundreds and thousands of downloads where people were using it. So,
But you have to tell them where those people came from.
well, there were a lot of people overseas and lots of people were using it in faraway places. And one place was Fiji that loved her paper. And I think she must have gone to Fiji on vacation. And
Hand out those $20 bills and
she has a following on Fiji. And another thing I want to add is I am a proud product of the Future Farmers of America. I did 4 years of Future Farmer, two periods a day. We had double classes for agri on the one hand and home ec on the other. You can guess which ones were for which. And if you graduated from Waldo High School, that's all you could do. So, and as Suzanne's saying, it had a lot of good things about it. It taught us parliamentary procedure and public speaking, and we had contests on all of that. And it was great, and it's still a great organization. And we had judging all kinds of farm animals and birds and so forth. And I was a judge on the dairy cattle team. And I and two others won the state championship at the University of Arkansas my senior year. If- I was going to say I will talk with you privately about the things that are involved in. Now, did you have a serious point?
I did. Gail Clam shares with us that the WSIU forums are on Thursdays at 7 p.m. beginning this week.
Thank you, Gail. And I was going to say, if I didn't add it earlier, League of Women Voters does a lot
And
of
did
this.
she
civic
give the
education.
website or anything of how you get to it?
It's on WSIU.
Okay, I'm sorry. You're right.
We don't need a website.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've been at it a while, Lily.
In your handout the first week, you said you were going to talk about critical race theory.
Oh, I didn't get to that, did I?
No, would you define that?
Um,
Can you define that briefly?
Can you define woman?
I think I had a paragraph somewhere that I just let get lost, but you know, I'm not sure I can because it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. At its most sort of innocuous level, it seems to me it tries to advocate taking into consideration the role of race and slavery in American history and in the Constitution for that matter. And we've
Okay.
been doing that stuff for really quite a long time now, although not very well in some areas. And then it gets down to a much more extreme, and the parody seems to be more on this extreme, which is the requirement is that if you're white, you've somehow or another got to feel guilty because of white privilege.
Okay,
And somehow or another, you're supposed to make the little school kids feel bad if they happen to be white. And that's why Florida and a ton of other states are outlawing teaching critical race theory. And which one of those are they outlawing, and what in the world are school teachers going to be expected to do with this? And what is the nature of the curriculum? Is it going to be, can you continue to talk about slavery as being a terrible blot on the American history and Constitution? Or are you going to get picked up, put in the pen for that? I don't think those things have been thought through very well at all. But from here, which seems to me to be self-evident that race has always been, still is, slavery's always been a influence and impact on American politics, down to, do you got to make little white kids feel bad? And you know, a lot of that stuff is just pure political theater, and yet state legislatures are lining up to outlaw the teaching of critical race theory. Pure political nonsense in most cases. You know, I think
okay,
school teachers and school boards and Illinois State Board of Education struggle with what are going to be the contents of the civic education that we teach in this state when it gets to these high charged, highly controversial issues like this. And I think school teachers going to mostly say, I hope the heck I can just not do much with this and stay out of trouble, because that's what most of them want to do. Yes.
Yeah, John, I was curious, you talked about the potential for increasing autocracy around the globe. Do you think what's going on with Russia now and between Putin and President
Zelensky.
yeah, Zelensky, you know, that's getting a lot of attention. A lot of people are looking at it from at Putin's side as a very negative thing. Do you think that may have an impact?
Well, I think that is a good point, and I think it's going to have serious ramifications. Ukraine was democracy and is a democracy, and it was pretty functional as democracy. And do people draw from that, well, democracies are a better way because look how the president of Ukraine acted? Or a lot of places it's very attractive to say an authoritarian guy like Putin can get his way. And so let's see how it turns out. He hasn't, his military certainly hasn't distinguished itself so far. But if they wind up with a big chunk of Ukraine, then maybe that's going to be attractive to folks in other countries where they've got sectional strife, for example. And I don't know, but I think there's a lot at stake here.
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sweden and Finland now are looking at joining NATO.
Yes, that's, the Swedes and the Finns are going to be voted on this weekend and probably will join. That'll make 32. And all of them are democracies, I think, except you can argue about Turkey. They've been slipping way toward the authoritarian end. That guy has regressed again and again and may never leave office, and Turkey may slip out of the category of those that we rate as democracies. But I believe all of NATO are democracies with some argument about Turkey. So yeah, again, light at stake. Gary?
Steve Kraft has a question.
Oh, boy, I thought so. I'll be disappointed if we didn't hear from Steve.
Take it away, Steve.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm not going to ask you about judging dairy cattle. My question has to do with, on the first slide you had dealing with possible changes. Could you explain the relationship between the federal guarantee of voting rights at the federal level and the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, which I thought essentially guaranteed the right of Americans to vote in federal elections, and why it's necessary to go back to the Congress to re-guarantee the rights of citizens to vote in federal elections. Isn't that right already guaranteed by the Constitution in those amendments?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it does deserve some elaboration. It was there, and 13th, 14th, and 15th should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. In reaction, we got Jim Crow legislation, we got the whole settling of the election of 1876 and the compromise to get the feds out of the South. And once the Fed army left the South started doing what it had always done. And in a sense, the direct legacy of that is straight to Lyndon Johnson and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, because after 70-something years, Johnson, a Texan, admitted that we haven't lived up to what the Constitution requires. And thus we got 64 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act. But the decisions that John Roberts wrote the majority opinion on, which is the Shelby County decision, basically eviscerated much of the 65 Civil Rights Act, because he said it's no longer necessary to ride herd on these offending jurisdictions, and there were 20 of them. We don't need the federal government doing that. And so they quit doing it. And take this one quick step further, there is an opinion shared by 2 or 3 at least of the current justices that is pernicious in my view, which says that if the state legislature does it, that trumps even the Constitution and federal law, because they ought to be able to do what they want to at the state level. I don't know what they do with the supremacy cause to the Constitution over that, but that body has at least 2 or 3 adherents according to some of the dissents. So are we going to implement and actually enforce the 15th particularly? It's not enough, wasn't enough, and now still apparently it's not enough. Does that make sense?
So that means we walk away from our Constitution then in this case.
Well,
We don't do it in other cases. I don't understand that cleavage. I mean, we have the conservatives running around genuflecting in front of the Constitution and being strict constructionists, but not in this case. Those amendments don't count.
Well,
Is
yeah,
that-
the amendments are suspect in some quarters. Suzanne's got a point.
Well, to give a little bit of substance to that argument.
Okay,
The Constitution provides that for the election of president, it shall be done, I'm looking for the exact language, as the state legislatures direct. So it's not that we've ignored the Constitution. It's that we've got something that says, as the state legislature directs, on the one hand, the 15th Amendment on the other hand, and how do we reconcile them? Now, for X number of years, we figured that state legislatures did not necessarily mean only the General Assembly. We sort of meant as the state directed. But it's an interesting argument as to what it means. And so it's not entirely ignoring the Constitution. Give the creativity to folks that went through it and said, hey, wait a minute, here's a phrase we've not explored and let's explore it.
Well, there are two parts of the right there, one by the 13th, 14th, especially 15th Amendment. Does that trump then something that the state legislature might do that would trample on that right to vote? Is going to have to be the argument at that point. Thank you, Steve. That was a good and complicated question. Okay, anyone else? Anybody out there in Zoom land? Glad to hear from you. Yes.
The electoral college, in order to abolish it, is it a constitutional amendment all over United States?
It would have to be changed by a constitutional amendment, and it would
So
require
every state will have to vote.
38 states would have to vote in favor. Yes, and that's very hard to get to
Yeah,
that number.
the Equal Rights Amendment. I remember.
Yeah, exactly. We've had 27, 28 amendments, and that's it. And first 10 of them sort of don't count.
So the odds are not.
Not good. Not gonna happen in my lifetime, as I've said before. Not gonna change.
Susan McFalls has a question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, this is going, this morning they were talking about the runoff with Macron. And I'm wondering how concerned we should be about that, because apparently his opponent would take us out of NATO or
Well,
affect the relationship with NATO.
Yeah, that Penn family, PEN family, they're now the second generation of hard right, and the daughter is the candidate, and she's even more hard right than the father. And she has been to Moscow and is apparently very friendly with Putin. So there's a lot at stake in the Macron runoff election. And
Do we know where the country stands at this point?
well, there's a chunk of it stands with Le Pen. I mean, I guess that's what the runoff is going to settle, but clearly there had to be, I haven't seen the results yet, but there had to be a big chunk of the voters that go with her. And it's sort of what I said earlier about negative voting. If you're mad at the government and mad at what's going on in France, and you're mad at the Muslims that are inundating the suburban areas of Paris, you can poke the president in the snout and show how angry you are by voting against him, whether you know what this woman stands for or not. So keep your eye on the French elections. There's a good deal riding on it, because Macron has tried to be helpful, and I think has been helpful in
Yes,
trying
I think so, yeah.
do what he's doing, what Henry Kissinger used to call shuttle diplomacy. And a couple of others have done that pretty well, including the character that is now the president or the prime minister of Great Britain, who showed up over there. Boris Johnson showed up over there and didn't comb his hair before he got out.
He never comes in there.
Everybody in politics got to have a trademark. Well, folks, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate all of you. And one of these days, maybe we'll do something like this again.